Joanne Lynn, who is the National Director for Advocacy and Government Affairs at Amnesty International USA and is based in Washington, D.C. Joanne has over 14 years of experience advocating for the rights of immigrants and refugees before Congress and the US government, and over 7 years of experience representing immigrants in family law and immigration proceedings. At Amnesty International USA, Lynn leads the development and implementation of strategies to advance the organization's human rights priorities before Congress and the US government. She leads a team of advocacy directors dedicating to protecting the human rights of refugees, asylum seekers, displaced people, prisoners of conscience, and gun violence victims. Prior to joining Amnesty International, Joanne worked at the American Civil Liberties Union for over a decade, leading the federal immigration policy advocacy program. Lynn has been recognized by the Hill as one of the top lobbyists for grassroots organizations. She has been a regular commentator on human rights through media outlets, including CNN, MSNBC, NPR, Washington Post, New York Times, Foreign Policy, USA Today, Politico, Washington Examiner, The Guardian, and others. Lynn is a graduate of Stanford University, Stanford School of Education, and New York University School of Law. She is based in Washington, D.C. I would like to also add that Amnesty International USA has played a very critical role in highlighting the deteriorating religious freedom in India, especially when Prime Minister Mr. Modi's government has vindictively harassed Amnesty International's India operations to the point of closing down. This closure followed when in July, Amnesty India team boldly published a detailed report following an investigation establishing the complicity of Hindu mobs and Delhi police in carrying out the anti-Muslim violence in Delhi. Perhaps that explains the closing of Amnesty India offices. Joanne.
Thank you, Rashid, for the warm introduction. I'm Joanne Lynn, and I am the National Director of Advocacy and Government Affairs at Amnesty International USA in Washington, D.C. And I'm honored to be here today with all of you to share with you what has happened with Amnesty International India in recent months. This year's celebration of the International Day of Nonviolence on October 2nd was particularly poignant. Falling on the birthday of Mahatma Gandhi, the International Day of Nonviolence occurred just days after the forced closure of Amnesty India. On September 30th, Amnesty India was forced to halt its human rights work after learning on September 10th that all its bank accounts had been frozen. Unable to access any funds, Amnesty India was forced to lay off all staff and suspend all research, advocacy, and campaigning. This latest action follows 2 years of relentless threats, intimidation, and harassment by the Indian government. But this time, Amnesty India had no choice but to bring its operations to a grinding halt. Needless to say, this is a devastating setback for Indian human rights defenders, civil society organizations, and most importantly, the millions of people in India who had been aided by Amnesty's human rights work. Amnesty's work in India is to promote and defend human rights for all. These values are enshrined in the Indian Constitution and flow from a rich Indian tradition of pluralism, tolerance, and peaceful dissent. Amnesty International does not accept funding from any governments for its research and advocacy to ensure that we can advocate and campaign with objectivity and impartiality in our mission to ensure human rights are enjoyed by all people. Established in 2012, Amnesty India worked to protect the rights of all in India, especially those most at risk, the marginalized, the victims of human rights abuses, human rights defenders, and victims of religious persecution. Between 2012 and 2020, more than 4 million Indians took action in support of one of Amnesty India's campaigns. Amnesty India grew into a movement with 100,000 donors. Amnesty India has pursued cutting-edge investigations and campaigning on a wide range of human rights issues, including extrajudicial executions, police violence against protesters, and the death penalty. Amnesty India has also fought for access to justice in Jammu and Kashmir, calling for the release of activists and journalists from administrative detention, as well as restoration of 4G mobile internet. It was in the wake of two major human rights reports that Amnesty India's bank accounts were frozen. The first report covered the February 2020 Delhi riots and documented police complicity in the violence against Muslims. The second report addressed arbitrary detentions and internet restrictions that persist in Kashmir 1 year after it was stripped of its special status. Both human rights reports contained findings critical of Indian authorities that were confirmed by other independent observers. Amnesty India has fully complied with all applicable Indian and international laws. Nonetheless, Amnesty India's bank accounts were frozen with no official notice. The Indian government's crackdown on civil society violates the rights to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and association, all of which are guaranteed by the Indian Constitution and international human rights law. Amnesty International USA has urged Secretary of State Pompeo and Deputy Secretary of State Began to press Indian authorities to lift the freeze on Amnesty India's bank accounts. The Indian government must guarantee the right of all civil society organizations to seek, receive, and utilize funding freely and safely. This is the first step necessary to protect the freedoms of all people in India and to ensure that human rights defenders and civil society organizations can continue to work in a safe environment for the benefit of all. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne, for all you do and everybody else in Amnesty International around the world. And we don't know how more information, more factual reports will come out of India now since Amnesty International India office is closed. Hopefully they reopen again soon. Thank you again for all that you do. Now, Sapta Giri is our next speaker. Giri agreed to make some brief comments. He's a board member of Hindus for Human Rights. Giri is a current student of social work in the Silberman School of Social Work, City University of New York. He has been an active member of Sadhana Coalition of Progressive Hindus since 2018. Giri. Go ahead, Giri. Did we lose him?
Yeah, I think that's why we lost him.
Yeah, we lost him. So I'll move to the next speaker. He might come back. Our next speaker is Arjun Singh Sethi, who is a prominent Sikh American human rights lawyer, professor, author, and community activist based in Washington, D.C. Arjun works closely with Muslim, Arab, South Asian, and Sikh communities and holds faculty appointments at Georgetown University Law Center and Vanderbilt University Law School. In the wake of the 2016 election, Arjun traveled the country and met with a diversity of people to document the hate they experienced during the campaign and after inauguration. A report titled American Hate: Survivors Speak Out was released in August 2018 and named an NPR Best Book of the Year. Arjun also serves as co-chair of the American Bar Association's National Committee on Homeland Security, Terrorism, and Treatment of Enemy Combatants. Arjun is based in Washington, D.C. Arjun, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me.
I want to start my remarks today by thanking all the organizations who participated, all the speakers who are presenting today. As you all know all too well, speaking out about the atrocities in India can subject you to trolling, doxing, threats of violence, as we know from folks who've spoken today. Folks in India who dare to speak out often pay the dearest price. And so again, just thank you for being here. Thank you for speaking out. I'll start my presentation by discussing Hindu nationalism. Hindu nationalism is rooted in the belief that India is a Hindu nation and that Hindus, who make up 80% of the population, should enjoy a privileged status and exercise majoritarian rule. You've heard a little bit about the RSS today, but just so that we're all on the same page, the RSS is a male-only volunteer paramilitary organization. Its earliest leaders, this is prior to World War II, referred to Christians and Muslims as, quote, internal threats, and compared India's Muslims to, quote, Jews in Germany. The BJP, who you've also heard a little bit about today, is the political wing of the RSS, and Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, its national leader. Modi himself trained with the RSS at the age of 8 and is a proud member of the RSS. Amit Shah, Modi's second in command, has called undocumented Muslim immigrants, quote, termites, and vowed, quote, to throw them in the Bay of Bengal. I bring this up today because one of the primary reasons that we are hearing about these atrocities is because Hindutva nationalism is surging in India today. And what we've seen is that that ideology is being furthered at the federal and local level, both through affirmative policy and by the failure to protect religious minorities. You've heard a little bit about the CAA and NRC. I'd like to speak a little bit about them. But before I do, I want to provide a general framing. The CAA and NRC combined are fundamentally an effort to reimagine India. It's an effort to render stateless India's 200 million Muslims, which actually constitute the second largest Muslim population in the world. The CAA on its face openly discriminates against Muslim migrants on the basis of faith. It gives Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, Parsi, and Christian migrants from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh who settled in India prior to 2015 the right to apply for citizenship, but again, intentionally and specifically excludes Muslims. And so the Ahmadiyya from Pakistan and the Hazaras from Afghanistan, who also face persecution, aren't eligible. The law also excludes persecuted religious minorities from Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Tibet. The CAA violates the Indian Constitution and international human rights law. The UN High Commission for Human Rights has called it, quote, fundamentally discriminatory. And I would add that human rights bodies across the world have uniformly come out and condemned this law. Many have called the NRC, the National Register of Citizens, the sister effort to CAA. And it's equally alarming. It's already underway in the state of Assam. And while the government has called it a census, it's really a policy of forced displacement. And we've seen the disastrous consequences of this policy again in the state of Assam, where the Assamese were asked to prove their Indian citizenship by providing documentary proof that they or their ancestors lived in India prior to 1971, evidence that in many, many cases did not exist. And so recently, the government published a list that excluded 1.9 million people that it claims did not have the necessary paperwork. And unsurprisingly, who was most impacted? Many of them were Muslims, women, children, and the impoverished, who again now fear that they will be detained and potentially deported. We've also heard a little bit today about the atrocities in Jammu and Kashmir, and I want to talk a little bit about that. On August 5th last year, the Indian government revoked the autonomy of Jammu and Kashmir without any legal foundation or consultation with the people. Security forces arrested thousands of Kashmiris, including children as young as 9, without any cause. There were so many arrests that the local prisons were actually full. And in some cases, Kashmiris were shuttled to unknown locations thousands of miles away. Again, detainees who have been released have alleged brutal torture. We also heard today a little bit about the curfew and again, the communication blackout that was imposed on the region. I want to remind folks that India leads the world in internet blackouts. And the blackout that the people of Jammu and Kashmir endured was 213 days, right? I know that when I don't have internet for a matter of hours, I often go into crisis mode. Imagine what it's like to not have internet, to not have these basic technologies that we regularly use for 213 days, on top of evidence of atrocities that have been reported by international media for some time. We also heard a little bit today about the Delhi pogrom, and so I wanted to add a little bit to that. In February of 2020, a pogrom took place in Delhi where dozens were murdered, the majority of whom were Muslim. Many, many months later, the survivors of that atrocity are not only awaiting justice, but even worse, many of the people who actually took to the streets to protest the CAA, to protest the NRC, to actually call for justice for the families of survivors have actually been rounded up and accused of planning the atrocity, meaning Muslim activists, Muslim organizers are now being accused in this diabolical conspiracy for actually planning the pogrom and the execution of their own people. And in my opinion, this atrocity really represents the culmination of impunity, both at the state and federal level, because we now know not only did the Delhi police participate in the atrocity, not only did they look the other way, but now after the fact, they're also providing impunity and they're actually arresting people who've spoken out. I want to also speak a little bit about hate violence in India today. In India today, Muslims, Dalits, Christians, Sikhs, journalists, and human rights activists are all vulnerable to violence. My colleague Matthias specifically spoke about what Christians have endured. We're going to be hearing from another panelist specifically about what Dalits have endured. A recent study has found that 90% of religious hate crimes between 2009 and 2018 occurred under Modi's watch. Lynchings are so commonplace in India today that they're often organized on social media and the videos uploaded online for the world to see. Worse, very rarely, if ever, does the government hold the perpetrators accountable. Recently, a cabinet minister, a former cabinet minister, garlanded 8 men who had been convicted of lynching a Muslim. And Modi himself rarely acknowledges the hate spreading across India. In the United States, actually today, November 16, 2020, the FBI released its annual hate crime report that tabulates hate crimes committed in the year 2019. It's an incomplete report, but it nevertheless attempts to at least make a good faith effort to, again, document the prevalence of hate violence in America. And so if you haven't seen the report, check it out. compare that to what's happening in India. And so in India's most recent hate crime report, believe it or not, they've published information about attacks committed by, quote, anti-national elements and jihadi terrorists, but specifically excludes data on religious violence and crimes against journalists, right? So according to the Indian government, there are hate crimes, but those hate crimes, again, are committed by anti-national elements and jihadi terrorists, but there isn't religious violence and there aren't crimes against journalists. I'll end my remarks with the following observation. I, again, want to really encourage the State Department to move forward and to designate India a country of particular concern. And really end with the suggestion that that designation should really have been in place for the last many years. The truth is, part of the reason that India is actually in the place that it is today is because there is a history of impunity that is longstanding. 35 years after the anti-Sikh pogroms of 1984, in which mobs murdered 17,000 Sikhs across 40 different cities, survivors are still seeking accountability. There is also yet to be accountability for the 2002 Gujarat massacres, during which mobs again slaughtered 2,000 Muslims and displaced thousands. And so again, part of the reason we are here is because there is that history of impunity, that lack of accountability. And so now, especially given the change of administration, is a particularly opportune time to move forward with this designation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Arjun, for that background and the context, the history of impunity, and going over the CAA and NRC connection and implications of it to millions of citizens. We all know too well the chronology of CAA and PR and NRC. Thank you again for your scholarship in this area. Our next speaker on the panel is Salam Al-Mariyati, who is the co-founder and president of Muslim Public Affairs Council, which has done groundbreaking work in civic engagement, public policy, and advocacy work. Salam is an expert on Islam in the West, Muslim reform movements, human rights, democracy, national security, and Middle East politics. He has spoken at the White House and on Capitol Hill and represented the US at international human rights and religious freedom conferences. His writings have appeared in every major national news publication, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and Los Angeles Times. His interviews have been featured on national and international news outlets, including CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and C-SPAN. Salam is an adjunct faculty member at Bayan Claremont, a board member of the Muslim Reform Institute, and an advisor to several political, civic, and academic institutions seeking to understand the role of Islam and Muslims in America and throughout the world. Deeply involved in interfaith activities, Salam was co-chair of the Interfaith Coalition to Heal Los Angeles, which formed in the wake of the 1992 Los Angeles uprisings. Salam is based in San Francisco. Salam is based in Los Angeles, and he is one of the prolific writer, speaker, and an American Muslim community leader. Thank you, Salam.
Thank you, Rashid. Thank you. We don't want to insult San Francisco since I'm from LA. They have something about Northern California and Southern California rift. But thank you so much for inviting me to this very important discussion. And thank you to the Indian American Muslim Council for your brave, courageous work pioneering our efforts and really showing a model of true civic engagement for American Muslims. And we value the partnership with the Indian American Muslim Council very, very much, very deeply. What I wanted to talk about was this issue of democracy in India. And this is to underscore the point that we are not against any country. We are not against India. In fact, we are in defense of the democracy in India. And we want India to remain a vibrant democracy that would base its governance on pluralism. And I think this is important for every country. And by the way, I know some of the reaction to our comments is, well, what about Muslim countries? Believe you me, we criticize Muslim majority countries more than anyone else. But it's about time to defend the rights of Muslim minorities and not use them as the scapegoats for what's happening outside their countries. And so this is in the defense of democracy and defending democracy as it relates to constitutions. And we're going to get into some very important changes in the Indian constitution that are happening that we need to be aware of, that most people are not aware of. And finally, this is about the threat of religious nationalism throughout the world. Religious nationalism is about using ethnic supremacy, ethnic religious nationalism, to impose its views on the rest, and therefore intimidate, if not persecute, if not annihilate others. And we have to deal with another genocide on our hands. So earlier this year, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, an independent federal commission that advises the American president and the US government on global religious freedom, delivered a scathing indictment of India's treatment of its religious minorities. The report said religious freedom conditions in India had experienced a drastic turn downward, with religious minorities under increasing assault. The report went on to directly blame India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who won re-election in May of 2019. Mr. Modi's government, the USIF reported, said had used its strengthened parliamentary majority to institute national level policies violating religious freedom across India, especially for Muslims. And this is what USIF reported earlier this year. Even more damningly, the report said Mr. Modi's government allowed violence against minorities and their houses of worship to continue with impunity, and also engaged in and tolerated hate speech and incitement to violence. Predictably, the Indian government responded with an angry denial and typically started name-calling USIF. In response to USIF's recommendation that the US government designate India as a country of particular concern, CPC, which is the US government's list of the world's worst offenders of religious freedom, the Indian government derogatorily called USIF an organization of particular concern. Importantly, though, the Indian government or its surrogates in the Indian news media did not refute a single assertion in the USIF report. And that is very, very important to underscore. While they engaged in name calling of USIF, they did not refute a single assertion in the USIF report. Unsurprisingly, the USIF report has gotten massive traction here in the US. Already hundreds of prominent American civil rights organizations have written to US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, urging him to accept USIF's recommendation and designate India as a CPC. In September, 14 US senators, 10 Republicans, and 4 Democrats also wrote to Mr. Pompeo, reminding him that a decision on India's designation as CPC is pending at his desk. A host of Muslim and Christian organizations, as well as non-faith-based ones, have started a vigorous campaign to persuade the US government to indeed designate India as a CPC. Of course, it is not just USIF that has called out India's egregious behavior towards its religious minorities. The United Nations Secretary General, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, various UN Special Rapporteurs, many US senators, and members of the House of Representatives and the world's leading news media, such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the BBC, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, The Guardian, and many others have endlessly reported on how Mr. Modi's government has enabled and empowered ramping xenophobic mobs that attack religious minorities at will, while claiming to convert India into a nation first and foremost of Hindus, who are its majority community. Now, this is done by using anti-Muslim tropes that we have seen before. It happened in Bosnia. In Bosnia, what happened is they claimed that the Muslims were foreign to the land. They were not indigenous to the Balkans, that they were actually Turk, and that they were violent. It was a part of their DNA to be violent, part of their religion to be violent, and that they were seditious. They were using clever means to usurp the will of the people of the regions. And this is similar to what Hitler said about Jews. What Hitler said about Jews in his infamous book, Mein Kampf, he said, the greater the intelligence of the individual Jew, the better he will succeed in deceiving others. So that is exactly what they're saying about Muslims today, that they are seditious, they're clever, that they're deceptive, that they are violent because of their DNA or their religion, and that they are foreign. And so the Muslims of India would be considered, for example, not to be really of Indian background, but to be of Arab background, to be really Arabs. They're not indigenous to the land. So we see this as part of the cycle of demonizing and dehumanizing a whole group of people in the subcontinent. While sadly, persecution of social and religious minorities is fairly commonplace around the world, India's situation is made far more alarming for two main reasons. Firstly, India is home to the world's largest number of religious minorities. Fully 20% of its 1.4 billion people, or 280 million, are non-Hindus. Only the national populations of China, India, and the US exceed that number. And secondly, while unfettered and state-backed religious violence everywhere else is mostly a feature of non-democratic societies, India is not only the world's largest democracy, it is also the most endurable one outside the Western world. Whereas even South Korea and Spain had long spells of dictatorships after the end of the Second World War, India distinguished itself remarkably among the world's newly freed nations for not only sustaining its democratic principles, but also its steadfast belief in religious and cultural pluralism. And that is what we are defending, religious and cultural pluralism as a main feature and component of an enduring democracy. The ascension of Mr. Modi as Prime Minister and his party's electoral success in securing parliamentary majority in two successive elections of 2014 and 2019 has come to threaten not just India's adherence to secular pluralism, but even its constitutional democracy. And that is what we were talking about at the beginning. It is the shaping or the distortion of a constitution that loses its democratic elements and therefore its democratic institutions. Last December, Mr. Modi's government brought a new law, the Citizenship Amendment Act, that introduced a religious test for the first ever time in providing an expedited path to citizenship for migrant communities. This law explicitly excludes Muslim migrants from that list, a turn that triggered massive street protests across India. Mr. Modi's government and various state governments run by his political party responded with brute police violence, killing dozens of people merely for exercising their democratic right to protest. Thousands of Muslims, including women, have been imprisoned across India. Muslim neighborhoods, homes, and businesses have been vandalized by not just Hindu extremist mobs, but also by the police themselves. In February, a former lawmaker from Mr. Modi's political party openly threatened violence against protesters in Delhi, India's capital. Violence broke out hours later, in which Hindu extremist partisans allied with Mr. Modi's party viciously attacked Muslim neighborhoods in a day of an orgy of violence. More than 36 Muslims were killed, literally butchered, many burnt to death. Yet the police arrested hundreds of Muslims, accusing them of carrying out violence against themselves. When a high court judge ordered the police to file a criminal case against that lawmaker, India's Supreme Court, which has shown itself to be ever pliant to appease Mr. Modi's interests, overnight transferred that judge out of the high court. That lawmaker has yet to be charged. Mr. Modi's government has now announced it will press ahead with what it calls a National Register for Citizens, or NRC. The NRC aims to investigate everyone's proof of citizenship. Last year, the Indian government concluded NRC in the eastern Assam state and found that nearly 2 million of the state's 33 million people did not have adequate citizenship documents, including those that have lived in the state for generations. Incredibly, the state's residents were asked to provide proof of their citizenship going back decades. Robbed of their citizenship, thousands have been incarcerated and now await an uncertain future. In a country where tens of millions, including Prime Minister Modi, do not have birth certificates, and where an overwhelming majority does not own land, being so poor, a nationwide NRC will render hundreds of millions stateless. Mr. Modi's ministers have already made it clear that they will use the new citizenship law to restore the citizenship of Hindus and other non-Muslims thus found without adequate citizenship documents. And this is another feature of religious nationalism, to impose one religion over another, not because you're following the religion, but for the sake of political power. Thus, the aim of the combined NRC-CAA is to disenfranchise India's 200 million Muslims. As the USURF report points out, the CAA would act as a corrective measure to protect Hindus that may be excluded from the NRC, but ensure that Muslims alone would bear the indignities and consequences of potential statelessness. It needs to be said that Mr. Modi's political party, the BJP, is merely a front for the massive self-styled social organization named the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, better known by its acronym, the RSS, which was founded 95 years ago on the principle of converting India into a Hindu nation with severely restricted civil and political rights for its minorities, especially Muslims and Christians. Even though both Christianity and Islam found roots in India in the first centuries of their existence, the RSS has continued to label them as foreign religions that are not sufficiently loyal to the motherland. Remember, this is one of their tropes. When you demonize and dehumanize a people, first you call them foreign, then you say they are violent, then you say they're seditious, deceptive, and trying to supplant your ways in your own country. This is what is happening to Christians and Muslims in India. So the government has threatened to take away the rights of Christians and Muslims if they do not accept Hinduism as India's dominant religion and pray to Hindu gods and follow Hindu practices. The RSS, the BJP, and Mr. Modi himself have never distanced themselves from these fundamental code of their Hindu nationalist ideology, which is called Hindutva. It is the same as would be if a white racist organization that envisions white supremacist America with little or no rights for non-whites, especially African Americans, were to float a political party which would then win the election and become the US government. That nightmare is already upon Indian minorities. The RSS is one of the world's most dogged Islamophobic organizations with a century-long history of carrying out massive violence against Muslims. Mr. Modi, who joined the RSS at the age of 8 years, has long been its most vicious foot soldier. In 1996, when Mr. Modi was a mid-level BJP operator, a celebrated Indian social scientist, Ashish Nandi, described him as a textbook fascist, quote unquote, after an hours-long interview. Mr. Modi's fascism came to roost just 5 years later when he added and abetted, some say even organized, mass violence against Muslims in the Indian state of Gujarat in the year 2002, in which more than 1,000 Muslims were officially killed.
Salam, you have a minute. You have a minute.
Okay. Well, then let me just go to the end. USERF has also recommended in its annual report this year that the US government impose targeted sanctions on Indian agencies and officials responsible for severe violations of religious freedom, including freezing of their assets and barring their entry into the US. Mr. Modi needs to be reminded of his own words that he spoke at a joint session of the US Congress in 2016, with now President-elect Joe Biden by his side. Mr. Modi had said that just as the idea that all citizens are created equal is a central pillar of the American Constitution, India's founding fathers too shared the same belief and sought individual liberty for all citizens. India's constitution, he had said, was a holy book in which freedom of faith, speech, and franchise and equality of all citizens, regardless of backgrounds, are enshrined as fundamental rights. Unfortunately, Mr. Modi's administration's actions and the reality of millions starkly contrast these values. It is up to us to hold him and the Indian government accountable to democracy and pluralism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Salam. Thank you. I know this is a very complex issue and a lot of history behind it, and I think you did some wonderful work there, going over trying to explain us this complexity of religion, culture, nationalism, and all that. Thank you for that. Our final speaker is Roja Singh, but I just wanted to prompt Commissioner Bhargava that after Roja Singh, would you please make few comments, closing comments after Roja Singh speaks. Roja Singh is the founder president of the Dalit Solidarity Forum. Roja teaches interdisciplinary studies including anthropology, sociology, women and gender studies at St. John Fisher College, Rochester, New York. Roja grew up in Chennai, South India, and moved to the US for further studies. She earned her PhD in comparative literature from Rutgers University in 2004. Her special areas of research, teaching, and study include Dalit studies and indigenous studies, with a focus on intersections of gender, race, caste, class, religion, and society. Her ongoing research involves the oral narratives and leadership strategies of women from indigenous communities. Roja is an advocate for the education of Dalit girls in South India, especially children, with specific focus on education. Roja Singh is author of Spotted Goddesses, Dalit Women's Agency Narratives on Caste and Gender Violence. She has engaged in Dalit rights advocacy for 30 years. She is the president of the Dalit Solidarity Forum in the USA. Roja?
Are you able to see me and hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for this invitation to be in this forum. I I know it's late, so I won't take too much time. Everybody has said a lot today, which I had on my notes as well. So I'm not going to repeat. Pardon me if I'm being repetitive. So I grew up in Tamil Nadu, India, and my family has roots in the Dalit community. And my great grandparents converted to Christianity. So I identify a lot with all the identities that are being spoken about here this evening. Dalit persecution is religious persecution, so nobody can argue that, right? So Indian nationalism is a phenomenon that has cleverly amalgamated political, historical, and sociological movements in building a nation founded on religious consciousness or religious sentiments, you can say. So religion as an institutionalized system of beliefs and the most powerful force in the world today sanctions both creation and destruction, has become the machinery for masculinist, sexual, and gender and caste politics, unfortunately. So the definition of religious liberty has two elements, as we all know: the capacity to manifest fully in public and private one's religion without interference from the state. The obligation of the state to protect citizens from anyone who might threaten the expression of those citizens' faith. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, International Convention on Human Rights proclaim the principles of non-discrimination and equality before the law and the right to freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and belief. So Dr. Ambedkar, Dalit national leader and architect of the Indian Constitution states, democracy is not a form of governance. It is a mode of associated living, conjoint communicated experience, and attitude of respect and reverence for fellow beings. So shamefully, we know that India is still home to the longest living social hierarchy in the world, the caste system rooted in Hinduism, a graded inequality based on pure and impure bodies, where Dalits and women and all other religious minorities are the outcast. As our previous speaker said, we are considered to be traitors, strangers in our own land, right? So in addition to the nearly 378,000 cases of violence against women each year, since 2016, human trafficking numbers in India rose from 8,200 to 22,900, most of whom are Dalit. Crimes against Dalits has risen by 37% in the last decade, which is under the BJP rule, with only a 2.5 increase in conviction rate. So over 10 Dalit women are raped every day, and there is a staggering rise in the rape and murder of Dalit women, even since September 29th in Hathras, when a young Dalit girl was gang raped. And that rape and burning of her body without even allowing her family to see it was authorized, right? The Uttar Pradesh police and the politicians actually stood and watched while that happened. So these are clear evidence to tell us that, you know, Dalit women's bodies and all Dalit bodies are lynched to make a statement that these bodies just do not matter, that they are dispensable bodies. Ambedkar basically questions, how do you expect to succeed if you allow the Shastras, the Hindu Shastras, to continue to mold the beliefs and opinions of the people of India? Reformers working for the removal of untouchability, including Mahatma Gandhi, do not seem to realize that the acts of people are merely the results of their religious beliefs, inculcated in their minds by the Shastras, and that people will not change their conduct until they cease to believe in the sanctity of the Shastras in which their conduct is founded. And he's directly referring to the Manusmriti, or the laws of Manu, which originates in a belief in the primordial man, so to speak, which denigrates and dehumanizes the Dalit and anybody who's not in the upper caste categories as demons. They refer to as Dasyus in the Manusmriti, and Chandala, which means traitors. So these are people, to quote from the Manu, the basic book of law states, he who associates with an outcast himself becomes an outcast, not by sacrificing for him, teaching him, or forming a matrimonial alliance with him, but by using the same carriage or seat, or even just by eating with him or her. So eunuchs and outcasts, born blind or deaf, the insane, the idiots and the dumb, as well as those deficient in any organ, shall receive no share in inheritance of the country. They're not even considered to be citizens, right? So this is how the Manusmriti actually instated into the cultural memory and the mindset that Dalits are not human. They are less than human. They're basically demons. So therefore, the Manu Dharma says that a Hindu's dharma is to actually perpetrate violence on Dalits and others and to consider women to be rapeable. So that is their dharma, that is their religious duty. So they are good Hindus if they actually carry out violence against Dalits and others. So where do you go from there, right? So these kinds of regimented religious patterns of thought and action is definitely being imposed even today. And we can trace this to the embedding of the cultural memory and psyche in scriptures such as Manusmriti and the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. So the Brahmins occupy the supreme rank, and therefore the untouchables, quote unquote, are the very impure servants as mentioned in the Manu. So despite the fact that untouchability was abolished under India's constitution in the 50s, the practice of untouchability, the imposition of social disabilities on persons because of their birth, is a stark reality where they may not use the same wells or the same temples, drink from the same cups and tea stalls, or lay claim to land that is legally theirs. So Dalit children are frequently made to sit in the back of classrooms, and communities as a whole are made to perform degrading rituals in the name of caste. And every day we hear stories of Dalit lynching, and also the ways in which Dalits are being shamed by being forced to eat human excreta. They're paraded naked, right? They're made to wear like chappals around their necks. And so these kinds of degradation are happening on an everyday basis just to reinstate the authority of Hindutva. So as our previous speaker said, the Sangh Parivar, in its form as the RSS or the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, is a fundamentalist group, right, that claims supremacy and a prerogative, an entitlement to threaten and use violence against those who do not follow Hindu faith based on the notion of grounded privilege. So these are clear connections between social rejection of peoples, religious ideals, and violence perpetrated. And we see that in Orissa, in the Kandhamal case, and Gandhian secularism questioned untouchability but not caste as a systemic power that saturates the national religious imagination. So therefore, the dominant caste communities under the name of Hindutva terrorism terrify vulnerable groups such as Muslims, Dalits, women, and Buddhists as well to mark a position of authority. Raping women, burning homes, churches, and mosques, and opening fire on innocent women and children are some of the methods. Since caste determines social status and therefore economic status, the ideology of caste both defines and makes permanent a social identity of separateness. So this segregation in itself a violation of human rights. So most Dalits readily accepted what they were offered through conversion. So therefore, most Christians in India are from the Dalit community. So even though very few Dalits are able to move out of their segregated colonies due to their Christian education, people do still face structural hurdles. Our family was an exception, being able to take the opportunity of education and rise out of that system of segregated lifestyle. I'm here today because of the education that was offered by Christian missionaries. So therefore, a lot of education institutions in India were started by Christian missionaries and hospitals as well. So it is ironic that today the Hindutva would actually go and torture and harass people who identify themselves as Christians and Muslims, because we basically wanted to escape that status of rejection, of being shamed and rejected by Hinduism. So the states of Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, Arunachal Pradesh, Orissa, and so many other states have actually implemented ordinances against conversion to reduce the fact that people would be scared and they would revert to Hinduism. So there is forced reconversion happening now under the BJP rule called the Ghar Wapsi as well. This is a national call for those Hindus who have converted to any other religion to come back to Hinduism, assuring them safety and economic benefits. The Hindu newspaper has extensively covered news stories of nationwide responses to this call, and people are terrified and therefore they are reconverting to Hinduism. And we see this happening on a day-to-day basis. Now, the hypocrisy of Hinduism as the land of yoga, in order for that yogis to practice yoga, they forcefully evicted indigenous and tribals out of their peaceful habitations. So therefore, this is violence embedded into dominant scriptural narratives in India. And therefore, we see this pattern of encroachment into property, encroachment on bodies, and mutilation of bodies as being actually sanctioned by religious scriptures and religious narratives in Hinduism.
Roja,
So,
you have a minute or so. We want to go to the Q&A. Please go ahead.
okay. So are Dalits Hindus? No, they were forced to be. There is religion and then there is religious coercion. Was there a formalization of Hindu identity for Dalits? No. They're Hindus only in reference to the untouchable in the Manu whom everyone must avoid. So therefore, we see that this is actually non-consensual appropriation of Dalits into Hinduism. They are actually spiritual people with animistic forms of worship. So this was a very clear strategy of Hinduism to appropriate Dalits into calling them as Hindus when they were not, and then using their own fingers to poke their eye to say that you are a rejected mass in Hinduism. So therefore, we see that today there is a rapid increase in violence against Dalits, violence against Christians. And as I stated before, most Christians are from the Dalit community. And every day we see that there is targeted violence against Christians and against Dalits. Thank you.
Thank you, Roja, for that education for us and everybody else. Thank you for taking time to share that with us. I have few questions, and if Commissioner Bhargava, I guess she had to leave. The question is also for Joanne Lin, which she was unable to wait. I don't have any other question that to anybody specifically here to panel, but I will ask one question, which is kind of very direct and specific question, then we can end it. The question is, if USERF, State Department accepts USERF's recommendations and moves India to CPC, what is the implication of that? What does that mean to India? That is a question, and that I think is a very good, relevant question for this whole panel. If any of the, maybe Arjun or Roja, if you could cover that, would be great.
Could you, sorry, could you repeat that?
If State Department accepts USERF's recommendation to move India as a CPC, what is the implication of that in India?
Arjun, do you want to go ahead?
Why don't you start, Roja, and then I'll go ahead and add on.
Yeah, I think we are definitely at the crossroads of having to really call out the Indian government, despite whatever the consequences may be. I think we have tolerated this kind of religious persecution for long. So therefore, bringing this under this kind of an international radar, and especially in the purview of the American government, especially under the President-elect Biden's administration, is so important, because we do see that in Biden's transition team as well, there are a lot of Hindutva presence, BJP supporters there. So it is really imperative to give out this call right now.
But what is the, if Arjun, you could cover what's the implication of it?
I mean, I think they will tell you in India, it doesn't mean anything. According to the Hindutva nationalists, every protest we hold doesn't mean anything. Every time a congressperson makes an inquiry, it doesn't mean anything. Every time a city council passes a resolution, it doesn't mean anything. But the truth is that there is a cumulative impact to this advocacy. Our allies pay attention across the world. The Indian government pays attention, which is why they organize and mobilize so heavily against activists who speak out, which is why at times they've even gone after, folks like Congresswoman Jayapal for speaking up. And so while I can't say or actually pinpoint the direct consequence, what I can tell you is that every additional effort incrementally matters. And when it rises to the level of the State Department, the Indian government pays special close attention because they want to be able to tell their allies, they want to be able to tell other countries that we're respected by the United States and others. And so I think symbolically it's important, but institutionally it also matters as well.
Thank you, Roja. If you have anything to follow up, if not, then.
I agree with what Arjun is saying, but I think Modi's government definitely is concerned about what the United States thinks about India. So this kind of a concerted effort to call them out will definitely have an impact, even though we may not see it, immediately and at the grassroots levels, but I think we will definitely see that it is at least sort of stirring them a bit.
I and also Indian American Muslim Council generally agree that irrespective of, we may not be able to define the specific implications of it, but we do support moving India to CPC. At minimum, it will have some deterrence about all the perpetrators, even the government officials who openly, impunity. At least, hopefully, that will reduce it, if not more. So, thank you again, everybody. Thank you for Roa. Thank you, Roa. Thank you. For all the panelists here who, sorry, we got a little bit late here, so they had to leave, but still, nevertheless, thank you everybody for making it, and thank you for everybody joining us here. I see there were at some point there were about 90 people joined in the daytime on a Monday. It shows that how important this issue is to a whole lot of people. So thank you again, everybody. And tomorrow we have another virtual panel like this. I'm sure you all know about it. Hope to see you there. Thank you.